again. We're moving into a really exciting part of today's symposium where we are having a bit of a panel discussion which tackles ethical decision making, inclusion versus equity, which has been kind of that theme throughout today's symposium. Joining us today, we've got three panel members, Michael Dobbie-Bridges, Robyn Smith, and Ben Newton. So there will be no presentation during this next part. So we invite members with screen sensitivity or would like to have a little bit of a brain break to just listen only. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'm going to invite Mick, Robyn, and Ben to unmute themselves and to turn their cameras on. I'm going to stop sharing and we'll spotlight our presenters. So I'm going to introduce them now. I'm going to firstly introduce Michael Dobbie-Bridges. He is a celebrated Paralympian representing Australia in wheelchair tennis. In addition to Michael's considerable sporting achievements, he is an advocate for promoting inclusion and support for individuals with a disability across multiple sectors, including healthcare and employment opportunities and wheelchair sports. His expertise include a high-level policy development and driving meaningful change within government administration industry. Also, you may have noticed in the chat, he once performed a really awesome hook shot at a local wheelchair basketball competition in Geelong. Maybe we'll hear about that later. I'm not sure, that's up to you, Mick. But could you please provide a visual and audio description of you, please?
Thanks, Ella, and I'll probably definitely throw the hook shot in there. I was actually just on the phone to Justin, just telling him about it again. Hi, everyone, and thanks for the opportunity. Michael Dobbie-Bridges. I'm I guess now middle-aged white male with greying hair, wearing a white polo in my home office.
Thank you. Now I'm going to introduce Robyn. So Robyn Smith has worked at a national level in sport administration for the past 3 decades as a Chief Executive Officer in sport inclusion. Her role includes working closely with government agencies, Paralympics Australia, national sporting organisations, including School Sport Australia, to develop appropriate inclusive services and opportunities for athletes with an impairment into the mainstream community. In 2022, Robyn was awarded the Medal of Order of Australia for her services to people with a disability through sport. And Robyn was the very lucky person to present us with our bronze medals at the recent Paralympic Games. So welcome, Robyn. Would you please provide an audiovisual introduction?
Thank you, Ellie. That was an honour. I am older than Michael, blonde, and at one stage lived in the same city as Michael in country Victoria, Benalla. I'm wearing a long sleeve dress and I'm in my work office in Benalla still.
Wonderful. Thank you, Robyn. And now to Ben. So Ben Newton is a respected Paralympian coach and accessibility advocate. He represented Australia in wheelchair rugby for 2 decades. In 2014, Ben was awarded a Medal of the Order of Australia for services to sport and now is the head coach of the Queensland Academy of Sport High Performance Program and assistant coach for the Australian Steelers Development Program. Prior to his coaching roles, Ben has worked for Queensland Rail for 10 years as the principal accessibility advisor. I'd also like to mention in there that Ben is a gold medalist in wheelchair rugby, and he also had the very, very lucky privilege of putting up with me as my wheelchair rugby coach for the past couple of years. So, Ben, would you please provide an audio-visual introduction?
Thanks, Ella. Yeah, I am Ben. I am a male in my 30s with brown hair, a beard, and I'm wearing a long sleeve blue collared shirt just in my home office as well.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ben. I just want to remind everybody that during our panel, we will be having discussions. If you do have a question for our panel, pop them into the chat and then we can get to those questions if we have time. So to start off our conversation around diversity and equity and inclusion in sport. I think I'll start with you, Robyn. How can we create a cohesive sports system and strong pathways for para-athletes by centering inclusion?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting listening to all of the different speakers today. I think it's definitely got to be an individualized approach. There's obviously there's physical impairment, visual impairment, athletes with intellectual impairment. In that, there's also in our landscape, there's the athletes with deaf and hard of hearing. So it's important that the approach is global, it's collaborative. I attended the High Performance Centre at the AIS yesterday, talking about 2032 plus the strategy, Winwell. It was fantastic to see so many Paralympians there, Paralympics Australia well represented, coaches, and NSOs talking about the need to work together to make sure that the Paralympic inclusion is occurring all the way through, but also that athletes can perform to their best. So I think there's not one answer fits all. I think it's got to be individualized. Just as I've said, I don't know how many times since Paris, there wouldn't be one Olympic gold medalist that was in Paris without their individualized coach that knew every little nuance that they had and what they needed. And I think the approach to parasport has to be exactly the same. And just one point that come up earlier, a little bit sidetracked. They're talking about technology, talking about all the things we need to do, talking about the plans yesterday to make Australia the best that we can be. But one of the things, I also sit on the International Paralympic Committee Governing Board, and one of the things that was pointed out to us that of the 4,400 athletes that competed in Paris, that 43% came from the 10 top countries. So whilst Australia's striving to be the best that they can be in 2032, I think it's really important as I guess global leaders in this space that we think about how we can make it more equitable, not only in Australia but right across the globe, so that the para sport movement is helping everybody with an impairment.
Yeah, absolutely. And how do you think we can create those pathways amongst, these groups with limited numbers? Like, do you have any thoughts on that, how we can create those pathways?
I know the IPC, through their membership program, is trying really hard to provide expertise across the regions and across the countries. But I really think Australia should be helping in that space, especially, we talk about on 2032 that sorry, I got another call coming through, good laugh, that the games, the 2032 games, and they're highlighted as Brisbane, but it's Queensland, it's Australia, and it's really the Oceania Games. So I think when we're working in the Oceania space of the Pacific, I think we need to be really good citizens, work with our friends across the ditch and make sure that we're holistic in our approach, so that we really do. Because I think if we're finding solutions for people in countries where they're not as lucky as we are, we often find solutions for ourselves as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Ben, you have come on as our wheelchair rugby coach in the past couple of years, and you have created a cohesive sports system here in Queensland around the wheelchair rugby program. What is the value of that participation and grassroots opportunity for the elite pathway, and why is it necessary?
Yeah, I think it's vital, right? Because when you break it right down, parasport for a country like Australia, particularly if you're wanting to ultimately not just support participation but also high performance, it's a numbers game for us. We're a country of about 27 million people, a little bit less than that, and one of our biggest competitors internationally is the USA, with more than 10 times the population that we have. So inclusion is, for somebody like me in a coaching role, it's a non-negotiable. We can't afford to have a different kind of approach and let people just come in and have a poor experience and then all of a sudden they're lost to sport. And I think the way we do that is by connecting ourselves better as coaches, as practitioners, as sports. Historically in parasport, in my experience as an athlete and now as a coach, there's been a lot of, like a lot of coaches can have this sense of that's my athlete or this is my patch, and they get very territorial. But we should be working together, and in a sort of resource constrained space, we should be working together to find athletes, whatever their aspirations are, whether they just want to get involved in sport or they want to be a Paralympian. Creating environments where they feel comfortable to experiment, try different things out, meet different people without being territorial or defensive or worrying like we're going to lose this person to another sport, because that might be where they're better off ending up.
Yeah, absolutely.
I might just jump in
Mick?
there. I think it's a really important point that Ben's just raised. Too often in the parasport space, we try and keep it all kind of in our own patch, as Ben pointed out, but we compete against other sports, other states, just other community sporting organisations. And I think something that around like the pathway development is really around more involvement of like community and club sports and educating them so that if someone with a disability turns up with their brother or sister who wants to play basketball, that there's a spot for them and there's a coach that knows or has an understanding of how to engage with that person and how to make it inclusive for them and fun for them. And too often we haven't got that education piece right, but then we sort of will send them to basketball, whether it's wheelchair basketball or any other type, and we just don't create that environment where they feel included. But they also don't want to necessarily leave their brother and sister. Like they want to play the sport at the level that they're playing at with their friends, and so it's really important. I think there's been a few comments today just around the really close ties between participation and elite pathways in parasports, and we need to broaden that pool. Ben pointed out again really well that our numbers are limited, our resources are limited, so we need to do everything we can to capture the people who have the slightest interest in any form of sport.
Yeah, absolutely. But so you mentioned participation as well as elite pathways. How do we create the link between those two? How do we bridge the gap between participation opportunities and elite pathways so we don't lose people and people aren't falling through the cracks, or they progress too fast and then they lose interest later on in life?
Yeah, it all. Robyn pointed out, like it comes back to like the individual and where they're at and what their aspirations are. But I don't think we always like we see someone come in, and I'm sure there's lots of people on the call this has happened to in parasport, where you join, then all of a like you kind of join the community in whatever reason, and then you've got three sports fighting over you, and it becomes quite political and not fun for anyone involved. Like, and I think Ben pointed out again, right, that it's how do you experiment? How do you just go and play a sport just because you'd like to have a go? And without being, oh, you're going to be the next Kurt Fernley or Ben Newton or Matt McShane or Alice Applejack. It's like, what if you just want to be yourself and just want to try a sport? And that's always the battle because our numbers are so small that someone comes in and goes, oh, I'd like to learn how to shoot a bow and arrow, and all of a sudden they're on a pathway to LA or to Brisbane. So there's nothing wrong with that, right? But it's on the individual. Like, we need to talk to the individual and understand what they want to get out of this. And if they just want to turn up and learn how to do a layup without falling out of their chair or nail an awesome hook shot from 3-point line right in front, then that's okay.
That's really interesting because I don't think anybody ever asked me what I wanted to do when I was young and first starting. And so often you get thrown into these environments. And I think if I, reflect on my journey, I was a young female with a disability who showed a slight interest in wheelchair sports. Next thing I'm being, fast tracked to the Victorian team. No business being there. And then it's, the steps after that just happen. And so, yeah, I wonder if somebody had that discussion with me when I was younger, what my career would have looked like. I mean, maybe, I don't know, but that's everybody comes into the sport at different times of their life as well. And we just need to be really mindful of those. All right, moving on to our next question. Thank you, guys. How do inclusion and equity factors, how does inclusion and equity factor into our legacy planning? So legacy, I think, maybe Robyn, will start with you because you've just come off the back of, the workshop yesterday, and legacy is being thrown out everywhere. How do we factor inclusion and equity into it?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think it's huge. I'm old enough that I was working as part of the Australian Paralympic team back in 2000. So, we had so many worries that there'd be no one in the stands, and we had all these plans to get people there, and literally you couldn't get a seat. Every venue was full. The Australian people just absolutely got behind the Australian Paralympic team. I'm sure that helped us, win, be at the top of the medal table at the end. It wasn't necessarily our main aim, but it really changed the Paralympic movement. Yes, I'm Australian. Yes, I'm biased, but the Paralympic movement took a huge turn at that point. And I think within Australia, it's probably slowed down a lot, but I really think it's ramped up in the last few years. And obviously, being involved in the sector for 3 decades, I've seen a huge shift. And to sit there yesterday and be talking about how we make change for the future, not just 2032, and obviously the Winter Games are important as well, but how do we actually change the future? People talked about it today. We need to have voices representing themselves, telling them, what their needs are, making sure that they're in the co-design phase. And ultimately, our bid for winning the Games in Brisbane was that 500,000 people would be involved in Australians would be involved in a meaningful way in sport and physical activity. And my goodness, we're a long way off that. So you talked about in your last question, for me, it's about normalising it so that everybody, if you're a parent and you have a child with or without a disability, that you're able to go to an activity just like everybody does at school. You try it, you like it, and it's normalised. There's a pathway if you're any good. If there's not, you just play with your friends. And as Michael said, we just need to train our sporting community to be inclusive, to understand the individualised needs. And if someone is talented, then there's a pathway like everybody else. And I obviously work, my paid work is working in the intellectual impairment space. So I know that the numbers are enormous. We're doing eligibility for school sport. And we need to be able to, we can't run the duplicate, the system as Ben talked about. We've only got limited resources. So we have to enhance the system we have to be inclusive and understand the needs. And then coaches understand the nuances. And then if there are any, the individualized needs, and then the coaches, the school teachers, whoever it is, understand that, and there's a pathway. So they may or may not compete in 2032. As we all know, not every sport is going to be in 32. It's got to be gender equitable. It has to be, there's a range of criteria that must be met to be a sport in 2032, and everyone's not going to be there. But that doesn't mean, I think, Ben, you hit on it, that we just got to get people able to be involved in the community, socially included. There's been people that have talked about it today. And I really feel that the sports sector can play a huge part, and together we can make really positive change. So, and that's the legacy piece. So yes, the games will come and go, but unless we get that legacy piece right, unless coaches are being understanding, unless leaders like the Sports Commission at the moment and the heads of NSOs are taking responsibility that sport is sport, so that beyond 32, it's different again for the new people coming through with a disability, parents that have a child with a disability. Their sport is the saviour in some respects.
Yeah, absolutely. Mick, Ben, would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah, I'll jump in. Just sorry, Ben. This is like probably the area that I'm most passionate about when we talk about Brisbane 2032. Like, I'm obviously having a Olympic and Paralympic Games in my now home city is incredible. So I'm excited about those kind of 4 weeks of competition. But the actual impact that we'll have for Brisbane is that legacy piece. And been, I guess, having conversations over the last kind of 18 months that my view, and I've got nothing to kind of back this up, but I will tell everyone anyway, is that the majority of the legacy piece actually comes from the Paralympic Games, not the Olympic Games. And the biggest changes that we can make in society are from the focus that we'll have on the Paralympics and the infrastructure and the social policy side of things that will flow on from that. Like, if we could make an impact on disability employment representation because of the Paralympic Games, we will change generations of people with disabilities' lives. If we get the infrastructure right, if we improve community access, like if we improve community engagement, like all that stuff is a direct result from like hosting a Paralympic Games. And so I will talk about this to anyone that will listen, in that we need to get moving, because we keep talking about where the stadium's going to be and which stadium it's going to be and whether that's the most important thing, but that'll happen. We're going to have a stadium. It'll be somewhere, right? We probably won't have.
That's fingers crossed.
We've still got over 7 years, Robyn.
Another 100-day review, we'll get there.
Which hasn't started yet. But the conversations we should be having now around that like social policy lens and what we can do in that space as well. And I think it's on this community and the Paralympians, both current and former, to really start having these really serious conversations around what society we would like to see follow in the lead up to and then following Brisbane 2032. And I've mentioned infrastructure. Like, I work in the infrastructure space. It's super important that we get that right, but they need to have the disability community involved in the conversations that are happening now. Like, they need someone with disability heavily involved in the 100-day review so that we can make sure that we are putting things in the right place with the right transport connections and all things are considered. Like, we need the right education and awareness campaigns. Like, it's participation again. Like, what are we doing? What, we want 500,000 people before the Games. What's the number we want after the Games? How do we make that happen? So lots of conversations that should have already started, and we're too focused on whether we're going to knock down a Gabba or build something at Vic Park.
Yeah, for me, like, this is all about co-design, and I thought Matt did a great job presenting on that a little bit earlier on. But whether you're talking about systems that support athletes, or we're talking about social policy, or we're talking about physical infrastructure and design standards and all that sort of stuff, it's all co-design for me. And it's not just co-design with users, with people with disability, but also experts with lived experience as well. It's critical to have both. It's not enough just to get a focus group of people off the street with disability. You need both. You need experts with lived experience as well, so that you're getting lots of different perspectives. And where, an athlete-centered approach to something like a sports system or a user-centered or universal design approach to a stadium, it's the same thing. It's the same thing. So for me, that's the critical piece.
Yeah. And can I just add one thing to that? From my perspective, we need to reflect the community in the volunteers for 2032. We need to reflect the community in the workforce for 2032 in every element, so that not everyone's going to be aspiring to be perhaps a participant in sport or competitor. So all parts of these games coming to us can actually change people's perceptions. And I have had just recently said to me, oh, we've put it out there for people to be employed in 2032 and no one's applied. And I go, well, of course they don't apply because they assume they're not going to get it. So there are people out there good enough to be able to fill those roles. And so I think the games, approaching the games for Australia, and I've already mentioned about being, a great country and inclusive for not just Australia, but other parts of the world. But from we need to change people's mindsets that they can apply for these jobs and they will get these jobs. And so that then the community is reflective and seen. And it's been fantastic today to have so many Paralympians and champions speaking today and being able to represent what's required, because that's when you actually change people's mindsets. And from my perspective, it's not as easy. I represent athletes with intellectual impairments, so it's not as easy for them to be as eloquent as you three, who've been, sporting champions. So it's important that we have, as Ben said, all parts of the whole to make sure that we bring along everyone on the journey.
Don't sell yourself short, Robyn. When I was growing up, you were the biggest name in netball in the Goulburn Valley, and so absolute legend of the sport. So,
oh my God! And don't tell everyone how long ago that was.
It's such an interesting, topic, and I feel like I harp on about it I've been harping on about it for ages, especially recently, about being, sometimes I am the only person in the room with lived experience to provide my own experience. And I'm sure Ben and Mickey and Robyn, we all feel the same way, but we can only focus on or provide feedback on our own lived experience. And I think that is so important when we're speaking about co-design and collaboration, in that we need to include people from every, walk of life, potentially, because like I said, I can only comment on what's relevant for me. And my life has been, incredibly privileged in terms of being a Paralympian and having access to a lot of support that a lot of people may not be able to access. So we have to capture the, the participation, the community element, so that we are catering for everybody, because that's legacy, right? Like Nick, you mentioned employment. Yeah. Tap someone on the shoulder. So if you know somebody with a disability that has the qualifications, tap them on the shoulder, be like, hey, you should apply for this. Or
and I think we are definitely going to need that type of intervention to give people the confidence to do it. But when I started working in the sports sector, they said, oh, we're not working with people with a disability, our focus is Indigenous. And I go, oh, have a guess what? There's people that are Indigenous with a disability. And they go, oh, no, we're focusing on women. I go, oh, have a guess what? There's women with a disability. No, our focus is multicultural. I go, oh, have a guess what? There's people with so there's so much universality, and so you can't just say we're working in that particular area, and this is where we can be really strong advocates and say, we understand what it's like to not be included as women, for example, women in leadership. You go, hang on. So it's just a lot of people with a lived experience have actually gone through this journey, and so they're the best advocates for the wider group. They understand what it is to not be included, and so it's really important that we have those voices. And it doesn't matter, Eloise, you've got one experience in one, you think it's limited. It's actually really important to be heard, so that we change people's mindsets, because you just don't know where you get to speak to people. It's really important to speak up and do that, because we've all been really lovely in our little area thinking, oh, we won't speak up. But I think it's so fantastic today. It's just been filled with people with lived experience, and we just need to get out there more widely.
Yeah, absolutely. It's such a space that I think we are all passionate about legacy, Brisbane 2032 plus. But I think from that, we have to have policy in place. So policy is the ultimate protector. What role does policy play in driving inclusion and equity, and what policies need to change? Mick?
Policy is critical, right? And I think as a community, we're really good at almost bypassing policy just with our kind of mantra of just getting things done. And everyone talks about how people with disability are like really good problem solvers and really innovative, and they just kind of get things done. And I'm like, well, that's great, but if we just had the policies in place originally, then we wouldn't necessarily need to rely on that as much. So there's a real critical element of policy development, which I think we need to focus on. And I was looking at the comments before, and like Jeff Trappett's always a big share in these things, but he makes some good points, right? Like, he's talking about a commitment to easy English induction for Brisbane 2032 volunteers. Like, if we just set that policy, that was going to happen. Like, Jeff's right, a huge sign to people with intellectual disability. And I think about, like, well, we've got $7.1 billion of public money that's going to, at this stage, go in. Although I heard a stat at a UQ event earlier in the week that the average is like 138% cost blowout for delivering an Olympic Games. So it's going to be a lot more than that. But if we look at it from that's public money. If we put a criteria, criteria on that, if you're bidding for any work, you have to report on your disability employment representation within your organisation. You need to have training in place. Like, all these elements are going to make a huge difference back to the legacy piece. But if we can get this right now, we will absolutely change the way that disability is viewed in Australia, while also like creating like incredible, meaningful impact for people with disability and their families beyond that. So, like, we need to get it right. And there's people from government on this call. Let's start having these conversations.
Yeah, if there's one takeaway I learned from working at Queensland Rail for a long time, it's that if you don't have important things set in policy, there'll always be an excuse to not do it, or people trying to find a way around it. It has to be set in policy for us to be able to go where we want to go. And the other thing about having this sort of stuff in policy to try and drive inclusion is that it gives us, ideally, it gives us consistency, and it gives us clarity in goals and in the outcomes that we're trying to get to. So, it makes sure that we're all rowing the boat in the same direction.
Yeah, I mean, I don't disagree about the policy. I think that's important, but I think it's representation. So, when I started working in the sports sector, there was mainly males on boards because females didn't really want to be on boards, and you go, really? And I think, you have to have representation to be able to speak the voice of the group. And so we need representation. So we not only need people with a disability, we need people with a disability on boards. We need people with a disability leaders. We need a seat at the table to be able to speak what it's about. And so, I remember going to a Cricket Australia conference, it wasn't that long ago, and it was representative, and they said, oh no, we've just got to have the men of each of the states and territories. They wanted to be representative of all the different types, but they couldn't give up their leaders in each of the state and territory. And since they've changed and they've had gender, they've had more gender equity, they said, oh my God, it's fantastic. You go, oh, really? So I think this is all of the boards and all of the representation needs to be also that. I mean, of course that's policy, but you need to have people with a disability talking about what's required to create this inclusive world, because someone with a disability is not just going to get on. You're not right, Ella, with saying that you just have your view, because the minute you have someone that's had to overcome some level of adversity is actually a sensational leader and speaker for others. So we need people with that lived experience to be able to talk about everybody. And I talked about before, you may be Indigenous, you may be from a marginalised group, but have a guess what? In each of those groups is someone with a disability. So this intersectionality is so important, and representation is important. So I know policy is key, but we have to be represented. We have to have people, if there's people on the call today, have the confidence to stand for these positions, because you're the ones that will make the change. Because as soon as people understand what you're going through, good leaders change straight away their thoughts. It's just they haven't thought about it sometimes. you know, they haven't thought, oh, why do we need a ramp, or why do we need to consider that? Why does it need to be in simple English? What, you know, what's the problem? And so it's just that, I believe it's just that people being represented and have their confidence.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think it's wonderful, and I wholeheartedly agree. But how do we ensure the voices are there? Who's responsible for that? Who makes sure, who is the one driving that, you know, the implementation of the policy? I think we want to have equal representation, and we've seen recently Annika Wells announced that there's going to be gender equity on sporting boards in sporting organizations, except for professional leagues, which anyway, like who's
They're getting better too.
Who is responsible for it?
Well, the government with the funding, I mean, it's, you have to have gender equity to get that funding. So it's government policy to be able to make sure that there's representation of all the groups. And I can just speak from the International Paralympic Committee point of view. There's total gender equity. There's universality. They strive really hard, and so from that leadership point of view, they're working with the membership of each of the countries to try and get those countries to do a similar thing. You know, if you're coming to an IPC meeting, that you hopefully have a male and a female, and that you have representation of an athlete. So they're trying to set policy. So I think it should filter down in the Paralympic world, but conversely, the other way, government should be looking at that universality as well.
I think it's also it's us, right, Ella? Like government have the policies in place, but as a community, we need to be like pushing for more. Like, it's great that Annika's made that announcement, but where's the announcement for, like, you have to have a person with disability on every board? Like, if every sport is focused on inclusion of people with disability and they're a Paralympic sport, then they should have to have a person with disability on their board to get funding. And so it's kind of, and I don't necessarily hear people prosecute that argument. I probably don't prosecute it enough either, but so it's probably on us to do that, or on the broader community to do that as well. I just think that if you're accessing government money, if you're a community kind of orientated organisation where something that you do impacts citizens of Australia, then you need to be held accountable for these things. And everyone's focused on ESG reporting and corporate social responsibility. I think let's use this opportunity we have to start pushing people.
Couldn't agree more, Michael.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I agree. And, you know, I wonder if there was somebody with lived experience that was sitting on the Basketball Australia board, would the gliders have qualified? I think it comes down to, you know, we look at NSOs and we look at people in positions to create these changes, or positions of influence, that, you know, they can ask the hard questions to the people on the ground doing the work. So yeah, how do we ensure that the policies are implemented on the ground and in sporting organizations? Like, how do we do that? Ben?
That's the $1 million question, right? Like, I guess, again, coming from some of my experience more in the infrastructure space than the sports space, but one of the places where this sort of stuff often falls down is where there's no consequences for not doing it. So wherever that's best to sit, in some cases it's probably government, in some cases it's going to be industry, peak bodies. You know, it's going to vary. I think it's going to vary, but yeah, there's got to be consequences or ramifications for not doing it. Otherwise, like I said before, people won't do it.
Like, if you take the example of like Virginia, which I know the acronym, but I can't actually tell you what the letters stand for, but they have, like, organisations over a certain size now have to report on their women employment participation. There's talk of that happening in the disability sector, and there's some work happening in the background around setting one of those up in Australia. There's another one that's being set up over in the UK. Something like that, where it's, I guess, putting the onus on the company to report on disability participation in the workforce, on other kind of general inclusion policies, tied to kind of the social responsibility piece. But especially if they're a government funded organisation or they're using taxpayer dollars for anything, then like setting something like that would put the onus on them. And there's not necessarily consequences, like if at the early stages of it, you can kind of build up to that. But if you could set it up that naming and shaming, I'm all for it. Let's just start doing it.
I mean, I think the analogy, and it's a shame it's hasn't moved along exactly the same pace, but the gender equity thing, the women's participation is now required in Australian sport of being 50%.
Yeah.
And I know when it was initially introduced, people would say, well, what are we going to do? You know, we're putting all these women in roles that don't know what they're talking about, and it's just for the sake of having percentage. And oh, wow, actually, those women have got really good things to offer. Some of the top sports in Australia said, I can't believe how we've changed our direction because the women have come on and just given us a different perspective. Oh, really? I said, wow, you know, women have actually added value. So I think by that type of that gender equity has actually really put a great slant on Australian sport, and it's not tokenistic. It's actually been really meaningful. And I think having disability representation is exactly the same. And it's exactly this, it's similar. I shouldn't say exactly the same. But women didn't feel confident enough to apply for the roles because they felt, oh, maybe I'm not experienced enough, and I didn't go to one of the private boys' schools in Melbourne, and maybe I'm not the right person to apply. But I think as we give leaders like yourselves the confidence that you can do it, then we'll get more and more leaders to go and stand for boards. And I think if it's a mandatory thing, then it's a mandatory thing. And it's what's happened with quotas with women. And I know there might be some men on the call that don't agree with it, but I think it's been one of the best things for Australian sport. So I suspect if you have representation of the different marginalised groups, you're going to have a far better outcome. And it's not just tokenistic. It's a far better look at what you need to be into the future.
I think as well in a sporting context like this, it's important to say too that this sort of stuff rolls on boards and things like that. We're not just talking about Paralympians as well. There's a lot more people with disability out there with a lot of views and input to give that are not Paralympians. Ex-athletes are always going to be an important part of the sport network, but it shouldn't be the only place that we look, especially in parasport.
No, I agree. And then you've got to, the high support needs is really critical. And I obviously work in an area with people that are not necessarily going to lead the country. Athletes with intellectual impairment, they need advocacy and support. And I know leaders like yourself do the right thing, but some just, you don't know what you don't know. So I think it's important that it's a holistic approach to the needs. And I agree with you, it doesn't have to be Paralympians. The good thing about Paralympians is that they've had to go through similar things, and then all of a sudden they've become incredible leaders and they understand, and so they're able to come back and it just perhaps lead for everyone. And I don't think it just has to be Paralympians, but Paralympians have had experiences that really give them some insights into in what society can look like.
Yeah, absolutely. And Ben, I'm just going to sidetrack a little bit. Do you want to touch on, the women's development in wheelchair rugby and how much we are growing in the wheelchair rugby space, and the value you've seen added, not by me, but by other people, other women and girls involved in wheelchair rugby, just from your perspective?
Yeah, sure. So for anyone who might not be across it, wheelchair rugby is actually a mixed sport, but it's been very heavily dominated by men. But the way the classification system works is that you get an allowance in your classification for the athletes that you have competing. For each one of them that is a female athlete. So Australia has been a leader the last few years in trying to get more women involved in our sport at all levels. And what we found is that it gives us a tactical advantage through the classification system, but it's also really added this really rich new group of perspectives into our sport that have never been there before. And it's helping people like me who are coming in as sort of the next generation of leaders in wheelchair rugby to try and create more positive, welcoming, inclusive spaces in our training environments and in our teams and in our competitions and across the board. And yeah, I think it's been a really positive thing, and hopefully it continues.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, one of the hottest topic at the moment is Brisbane 2032. And we heard from Natalie this morning about some of these topics as well. In quality or quantity? So should we be focusing, or should we be trying to get as many athletes as possible into as many races and sports and teams? Or should we be focusing on athletes with chances to get medals? I'm going to open the floor.
Both.
Why?
Well, I think like we've obviously already discussed the really close link between participation and elite pathways for parasports. So we need that kind of the groundswell at the bottom to drive that quality at the top. And so like in lots of like in team sports, when the team is better when there's competition for spots. And so I think if we can increase the numbers at the participation end, you will inevitably get more people pushing through. But like you can't just focus on one or the other, because like we could have like the 500,000 people participating, but if none of them actually want to go ahead and go any higher than that because the pathway is not inclusive or supportive in any way, then I think we'll run into problems anyway. So like, I don't think it's an either or. It's got to be both.
Yeah, I totally agree. And this kind of gets to what I said back at the start of the conversation, right? That somebody might come to one of my training sessions because they've seen wheelchair rugby on the Paris coverage and rock up, and they might be absolutely hopeless at wheelchair rugby and have no chance of progressing along the pathway, but they might potentially be a world-class level club thrower in athletics. But that may or may not be what they want to do, and they should still have a place to go to one way or another, whatever level they want to do at. We know everyone here, I'm sure, is in complete agreement about all the different values that, all the different areas that bring value to people's life by being involved with sport. So, yeah, you shouldn't be disadvantaged or excluded just because you don't necessarily want to be a Paralympian. And from a sport like wheelchair rugby as well, where we have relatively small participation, your Riley Bats need players that are only at club level to be able to train with, to compete with. He's not going to be the best athlete he can be if there's not players in the training environment or daily performance environment with him to support him.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know I've seen Riley battle it out against me and other club level players as well. So, and if it wasn't for us being able to build numbers, I don't think we would have been able to have such a good training environment leading up to the games. So, and it's something that Ben always encouraged people to come along so that we can have that competition.
I think
And
that
then
the point out, sorry, that the spinners do really well as well is getting just more people involved, and so you can have that competition. And I hear people who aren't necessarily in agreement with the model that they run up there, but I'm a huge fan of it. And it's the same in AFL wheelchair, right? Like it's just a completely inclusive sport. So if you're disabled or non-disabled, you just turn up and play, and we wouldn't have a competition of like 4 or 5 teams if we didn't allow non-disabled people to play. And so I would rather have a strong competition than have no competition, or a competition of like 2 teams. So I think it's super important that we remember that. And also, like, I probably am not the best at this, but it's really important for former athletes to kind of go back to the community and help out. And I do it in some way, but like I probably should play tennis more often, because the young kids coming through playing tennis can learn from former athletes, and not necessarily in a direct coaching way, but just in a supportive mentoring kind of way. And like the odd time that I do go back like twice a year and play, kind of gives me a bit of a pep up when I bet there's young kids coming through. It's nice.
Yeah. I mean, from my perspective, it does have to be both. We have to sharpen the pencil and help our high performance athletes be the best they can be. But the play well strategy, the Sports Commission's put out to try and get sport and opportunities, more opportunities for people with a disability right across the country, just to be active more often. And I don't think you have to be a rocket scientist now. If you haven't got more people coming into the base, you're not going to be able to have the fine-tuned at the top. So, but having said that, it's not going to just solve it if you put all your money into participation. You have to allow them to be the best they can be. But having said that, I'm representing all countries and the whole movement, and think about what I said earlier today, that 43% are coming from 10 countries. Then the Paralympic movement can't become so elitist that it cuts out the greater masses, because, as someone said earlier on the call, the essence of the Paralympic movement is so unique that it's really represents humanity. So, being good Australians, we need to always remember that movement, that yes, it's important to get a gold medal, but it's not the only thing that we can actually change the perception and the circumstances for people right across the world with a disability who've got, just been working with someone in Timor-Leste and he's got no wheelchair, and he's the president, and he hasn't, what he has is phenomenal. So you think about the president or the Secretary General of Timor-Leste Paralympic Committee doesn't have a wheelchair and proper equipment. So, you know what I mean? Like we can be really good Australians and we can do the best we can, but for me, it's a humanitarian movement using sport as that vehicle to really change people's lives, and be good Australians and be competitive, but let's not get lost in the mire for all the gold medals, even though I know we've got to try and do both to make sure we maintain funding. But, there's been the biggest injection ever into the Paralympic movement in this last budget. So we have to use it wisely, but let's hope that it really changes the perception, and we have parents of children with a disability with hope that sport can actually change their lives. So, we've got to do both.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, Brisbane 2032 offers a unique platform for us to grow sports that we haven't seen qualify since, Sydney 2000, like our sitting volleyball team. And I've seen recently that we've got a sitting volleyball team over competing overseas for the first time in my career. But this, I think, has only been ignited because we haven't had a sitting volleyball team since, I'm just using it as an example, since 2000. But how do we ensure that these teams and participants have a lasting success beyond 2032?
So from my perspective, it's a catalyst. It's a starting point. Not everything's going to go through to the end and be hugely successful, but it gives people an opportunity to have choice. I think someone said earlier, to have choice of being involved in an activity. So, you know, it could be that sitting volleyball takes off in the country, and what a great outcome that would be. We can't say no because it's too difficult. I think we've just got to embrace it. So there may be a whole lot of children out there that go, oh my goodness, sitting volleyball, I never knew, and I've loved it, and get involved. And I feel the same about the Paralympics in itself. The people of Paris moved out of Paris. They were away. They didn't want anything to do with it, and they came back in droves for the Paris Paralympics. They were absolutely enamored with it, and all the stands were full. You couldn't get tickets. The French presidents just put a heap of money into disability sport in France to try and cater for the numbers turning up. So, my goodness, let that be our problem beyond 32, and have people think that sport is for them. And so that's the opportunity we have for a legacy, to have people say, you know, my son went to the wheelchair rugby in 2000 and just didn't understand why he couldn't play. He was born into me doing this job, and he didn't have a clue that these people didn't necessarily get out of their chairs. He just wanted to play wheelchair rugby. He was absolutely enamored with the game, totally and utterly. So, you know, that's what we want, future generations seeing the athletes and the performance and not seeing anything else. It's all about sport. It's about athletes first for me.
My little boy, Robyn, he does this weekly sports program, and he got told that he was doing AFL next week, and he asked the coach whether it was wheelchair AFL or stand-up AFL.
I love it. Yeah. The role model, the best role model, huh?
And then did you offer to bring wheelchair AFL into the school?
Oh, he's not at school yet. It's this little program, but I do go along when he does, like whenever he does tennis or AFL, I go along and help the coach out. So I'll talk to the kids about it.
Ben or Mick, did you want to add anything to the question around how do we ensure that teams have lasting success beyond 32?
I think again, it's kind of one of those things that's on us a bit to show the value that the investment brings as well, beyond just medals. And you know, I think we probably all want to hope that you know, it'll just sort of flow naturally, but that doesn't mean that people don't need to be out there promoting it as well, and you know, being very loud cheerleaders for it, for all the benefits.
I think Paralympics Australia are doing really good things, and they do a wonderful job at promoting their current group of athletes. And I think there could be something around promoting the impact that the Paralympic movement has had on athletes from years gone by, because like there's a lot of super impressive like Paralympians, and I say Paralympian, I mean there's obviously super impressive people with disability doing all these wonderful things in the community, but with the focus on sport, I'm just choosing to use Paralympians as part of that. But if Paralympics Australia could show the politicians and decision makers in our country the impact that former Paralympians are having on the community and within organisations that they lead or are a part of, I think it would make the discussion around future funding and future legacy planning stuff much more easier for them to digest.
Yeah,
I agree. So Mick, it just seems to me you've given yourself another task to do. If you could go and collate all that information, that would be wonderful.
My wife is putting a stop on extracurricular activities, given our 9-month-old doesn't sleep.
All right, we'll take it on notice, and we'll I think actually that's great. I think it is really crucial, because how do our government see, or they're like, yes, we understand that people, you know, with lived experience can add value, but how? Let's show them like evidence.
Just to give you an example, in I think John Wiley was leading the Australian Sports Commission. He was the chair, and his life changed when he went to Tokyo Paralympics, and he came back and was a huge advocate for the Paralympics. I know in in where were we? Paris, sorry, that all the sport leaders were there in the same room, you know, and they've come back as huge advocates. So I think where the leaders see it, they don't need anything more. And so once you've got people speaking about it and totally engaged, that helps. We already know, we're already sold on this call, and probably, or the ones on the screen right now are already sold what it can do. And I'm sure many of the listeners as well, that it sells itself once you get them there. And so the leaders get there and see it, and it becomes, you know, and you couldn't have a better leader on 2032 than Kurt Fernley, who is constantly advocating, and in a lovely syrupy way that he does, his smiling face, but you know that he's pushing forward the case and making sure that people understand. You've got the Paralympics Australia's just have got all these athlete representatives, and they haven't had as many people with a disability represented for a long time. They're great leaders, role models. And so, you know, it is changing, and I think it's about getting some of those leaders to experience it, to just fully understand it, and then becomes second nature for what they do. They don't have to be told and hit over the head all the time. They just start to see it. And I guess, I know Sean Tweedy's on the call, and if I don't say something, but it's also so important that it's not only gender equitable, and I think people have highlighted that today, that we need to make sure that we have more gender equity in the movement, but we also have to have people with high support needs. And we need to make sure we represent a whole sector, and we're really good citizens, and we're not just representing, you know, top level wheelies like yourselves, but we're representing the whole sector. And I think that's really important that we do that. But I think it's changing, and I think our leaders are starting to fully understand that.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, final question from me for you all before we go to some questions in the chat. In your opinion, what needs to change to allow us to achieve our greatest Paralympics on record? Big question there, and I hope you can't hear my dog drinking water behind me. She is drinking it so loud.
I think we're on the path. I think the win well is a wonderful strategy. It's a long strategy leading into the games. I think there's a lot of leaders within that movement that have had of lived experience. I think the injection of the money will help, and I think having more leaders that have experience involved in a leadership point of view. And you know, I think we're on the task. Obviously, the games, the team we took away in Paris wasn't a huge team. The team we had in Sydney 2000 was enormous. The team that we had, I know that team was buoyed on by the crowds. We were very parochial. I think the French were probably buoyed on by their crowds just recently in Paris. I'm confident that we'll do well in Brisbane in 2032, and my hope is that I think we definitely moved the dial from Sydney 2000. It changed the circumstances, but it didn't change it enough, and there was a bit of a lull. So it would be wonderful to think that all the learnings from Sydney 2000 go into 2032, and we perform well. I'm sure we will. We'll have a huge team. We'll be represented in every sport. We'll do the homework. We've got the money in the system. And then the legacy is that kids everywhere it's just second nature that they play sport, they're included, there's coaches, there's just knowledge and appetite, so that it doesn't fall over for whatever that year is. I probably won't be alive in 2036, but you know, there's ongoing. So I'm really confident that we're on the right path.
Yeah, I agree. I think and I guess a positive that I've seen recently, I just saw Dane Cross from Sporting Wheelies put a comment in the chat. Like 2 weeks ago, I think there was an article in the ABC about the increased funding for high performance sport, and he got his comments in that article. And it was really positive to see that an organisation such as Sporting Wheelies is kind of more focused on the participation element of it now. Wasn't critical that there was more money for high performance. It made the point really well that that's great. we also need a little bit of funding over here for participation, but we can't do that at the expense of the high performance side of things. And I thought that was a really well made argument, and gives me hope that the sector is now kind of understanding a bit better that we all do need to work together. So, but I think we're on the right track, and keen to see what we can achieve in 2032, whether as a administrator within it, or maybe even future athlete.
Oh, had it here first.
Yeah, for me, I think if we're thinking about what needs to change, I think it's the that connection and collaboration piece. It has certainly improved since I came into sport as an athlete, but there's a long way to go, and I think that's where we can make some of the biggest gains towards achieving that goal of having a really successful result in 2032. And that's connections between those different levels of the pathway that Michael was just talking about, and Dane's been promoting as well. And it's connections between sports as well, and Paralympic Australia and the NIN, all those different parts of the systems where we're making sure that people are coming into parasport feeling welcomed and safe, and finding the best place for them, even if that's not necessarily the place that they start at. Where they're ending up is the best possible place for them.
And can I just add one thing? I'd like to think as Australians, and conducting the Games in 32, that we improve the whole Oceania region, so that success needs to also look at our neighbouring countries that can benefit from, people with a disability in those countries can access sport and be engaged in some meaningful way. So I think success shouldn't always necessarily just be about gold medals, but how we move circumstances for all of our neighbours as well.
Yeah, I agree. Well, thank you guys for those questions. I'm going to go to the chat now. We're going to go back a little bit. So this question is from Ross. Given coaches / administrators are key to facilitating a safe and inclusive experience, should coaching / sport administrator roles, especially when there's a tiered system, level 1, 2, or 3, mandate specific education around disability inclusion, similar to how we mandate safeguarding and anti-doping education? Would such a mandate raise the capacity of our coaches to have discussion without fear of offending people with a disability? Oh, great question, Ross.
That's a very easy question to answer. Yes.
Yeah, definitely. But it doesn't replace the need to be athlete-centered and have an individual approach with whatever or however many or whoever the athletes are that you're working with as a coach. Whatever your sport, however experienced of a coach you are, training is important and it should be mandatory, but it doesn't replace the need to have an individualized athlete-centered approach.
I agree on the concept. I get nervous around mandating things. And part of me goes, well, if you mandate it, then everyone has to do it, and you get an uptick anyway. But I'd rather us kind of educate people on the benefits, and whether it's to individuals or to the environment that coach or administrator is in, so that they want to do the training without it being mandatory. But we may be at the point where we just need to mandate it because other efforts aren't necessarily having the impact we need.
But I guess that then goes back to the whole policy thing, and we want to mandate policies, right? So we want, like Ben mentioned, if we don't have policies in place, it just allows people to not do things or bypass policies. Yeah. So I think if I look at this from a lens of being a female with a disability, I would 100% want my person, my coach, anybody to have a deep understanding of my experiences of living with a disability. And I think something like that would come from disability training, whether it's mandated or whatnot, but it has to be embedded, I think, policy, systems and whatnot. So yeah,
Funnily enough, they've had to do it for 50% of the population. They've had to put policy in place to look after 50% of the population. So I don't think there's anything wrong with mandating policies. And, you know, we need representation. People need to see it. And there's nothing stronger than hearing it from someone with a lived experience to really get a very deep understanding of what it's about.
One of the things in this space that we know we need is one of the big barriers in parasport is more coaches, right? More parasport coaches. So the way I kind of think about it is that if you mandate some sort of introductory sort of training of some sort about working with athletes with disability, then I'd like to think that then would give somebody the sort of base level confidence to think, okay, I could coach para athletes, I think. And then the next step would then be to open up some of those conversations with the person, with the athlete, where, yeah, otherwise they might be a little bit worried about offending or, you know, asking the wrong thing or something like that, which we know it's something that we all come up against all the time.
But you highlighted it earlier, Ben, when you said an individualised approach. If you take an individualised approach, it's regardless of gender, nationality, disability or not. I mean, so if we want Australia to be successful and we want to be good citizens in our region, it has to be an individualised approach.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, next question is, some athletes/disability groups may not have an equitable way to share their voice and feedback to co-design. How will you ensure all disability groups, and especially intellectually impairment, will be included? Who'd like to go? Robyn?
What am I? 34 years at the end of this year, striving for representation of athletes with intellectual impairment. With a person-first approach. So I think advocacy is absolutely vital, and I advocate for anybody to be able to prevail in sport of their choice at the time they want, with a focus on their ability, not anything else. So it's something that we talk to government. I've definitely seen a shift. As I said, being there yesterday and watching the Sports Commission and their Win Well strategy and the amount of representation in the room, the amount of women in the room, the amount of multicultural in the room, the amount of elite athletes in the room with a disability, sensational. So we're getting there. It's not perfect, but my goodness, you know, it's a person-first approach in Australia. I'm very proud of that. Very proud of how we treat our peoples, and so I think that we all know that we have Indigenous Australians with a disability. We know we have men and women and so forth. So I think we're doing okay, and we just have to remember. I mean, you three, as leaders, you represent your whole movement. You don't just represent your own needs. As you get to be a leader, you understand you have to speak with a wider lens when you're representing your cohort. So it's just really important that we continue to strive to do that. We're in a good place, but we can always be in a better place, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Another question here is, it would be interesting to know what skills and competencies you would like to see from sport graduates entering the workforce in terms of supporting parasport. Interesting. Mick, what do you think?
I think it comes back to the conversation we had just about 2 questions ago around training and that type of thing. I think there needs to be that desire and from the cohort that they would like to, or they see this as a realistic kind of avenue for them to achieve their career goals by working in parasport. But I think if we can educate them on that through their studies, that would be a good start.
Yeah, and I think also knowing, even if that's not necessarily sport itself is not necessarily where they want to go in their career, at least being connected enough into the right networks to be able to steer people into the right directions or the right pathways or something like that, where they do come across people through their work who maybe do want to explore sport. And if they're not the right person to support them to do that, then that's fine. But having the connections to be able to connect them with the person who can is a really big thing.
I guess I feel a little bit more strongly that if you're in a particular area and you are a teacher or you're going through a particular area, coaching, whatever, that it's a person-first approach and you have to be looking after everybody. You don't have a choice to say, I'm only doing white males from 15 to 25, unfortunately. Society is just not like that. So all of those education places should be focusing on person first. And if it's their sport, they own their sport. They should be looking at what they need to do to make sure all people, Australian people living in Australia, can access that sport. And I don't think they've got a choice to pick and choose anymore. I hope not.
Yeah.
Also, it hasn't really come up in the discussions we've been having, but classification as well. Classification is a big space where I think we can upskill graduates in allied health fields and things like that as well. There's always a need for more classifiers in and around all sorts of sports. So and it's crucial to have an understanding of it, right? To be able to support para-athletes as a professional, whatever you field, you need to have an understanding of classification as well.
Yeah, huge.
I mean, can I just say one thing to that if we work with sport to be inclusive and to think person first, because some of those people that will want to play sport, there isn't a Paralympic pathway. And so it's just really important, as I think you talked about earlier, Ben, that it's not all Paralympic representation, that sometimes if people want to be involved in sport, and it might not even to be competing, but if they want to go down to their local club and be involved and it's a person first approach, they may be a sensational statistician or be involved in that club in a meaningful way. So sport has lots of things to offer. And yeah, I think we just need to take that person first approach and make sure that they can be involved in sport, and they may end up being coaches like yourself. There's all sorts of roles. They might be political leaders like Michael. Everyone's got a role to play to sort of change people's thought processes.
Yeah, we actually have an athlete who's relocating to Queensland at the end of the year who is pretty new to sport, and she's going to start university studies when she moves because she wants to be a data scientist, and she never really considered that as a career goal until she got involved in sport.
Yeah, sensational. Yeah. And look at our politicians. Some of our best Paralympians are representing the country at particular levels of politics because they get the confidence, they recognise their huge abilities, and then they're able to go and represent the people. And so, there's anything's possible. We've just got to keep challenging people to, well, one, feeling confident, but two, the general public to understand the huge abilities of our group. And I can see Jeff Trappett writing in the thing, and he's talking about. He's used his sporting career to be, a person working in government, changing the world in his realm. So it just gives you a platform to do great things.
Is our unofficial fourth panel member.
Oh, right. Okay. He is. He's really. Hi, Jeff.
This question comes from Kelsey, and she says a focus on policy is critical and provides those drivers for change. However, I wanted to ask about grassroots implications and pathways, especially within schools. I know from my partner that aside from great engagement from me, HPE teachers have limited knowledge and capacity to support classification, teaching inclusive sport, and engaging their students with disability. What can we start doing now to grow participation and sporting development in schools from primary schools? Now, I think this question is a little bit I love this question, but it has a lens on policy and also legacy. If we look at the legacy of the Tokyo Paralympic Games, a part of their legacy was they had the Paralympic I'm Possible educational resources embedded into their national curriculum. So every student that goes through schools from now on, they will learn about Paralympic movement, Paralympic sport, classification, and whatnot. In France, we saw their legacy in schools was 30 minutes of physical activity every day, which includes inclusive and para sport. So for me, I think this is a massive legacy piece, and, Mick, Ben and Robyn jump in as well, but we need to embed it into our curriculum. We have to have inclusive sport as an option, not as a other. If that makes sense.
I don't know what's changed. I'm a physical education trained, and that was what I had to do. That we did that, and I loved it, and I've been involved since. So I don't understand if you're exactly the same as you're a phys ed teacher, you have to be working with all children. You don't have a choice to go and choose that group of. It's just not what it's about. So this is back to the every teacher, every service deliverer should be delivering services for the whole community. You don't have a choice of who you pick. And so I think it's a person first approach, and phys ed teachers not knowing what they should know. It's not good enough. End of story. They should be able to provide physical education for all their students into the future. And you're full of university people here today, and every university course should be for everyone. Phys ed is for everyone.
Yeah, I agree. I think often, as part of my role within Paralympics Australia, we get requests from teachers who they just have no idea. And I'm like, as a part of my teaching education, you had to learn how to differentiate. You need to learn how to differentiate learning from everybody. And I think maybe, sometimes PE teachers get lost along the way, and it's just you want to have fun and kick a ball and whatnot. But I've had experiences where in my education to become a teacher, we engaged with activities of, cricket, AFL and whatnot. And I asked how I can participate in cricket, and the people delivering these activities were like, I don't know, sit over there. And I'm like, I'm an adult. Imagine if these organizations go into schools and they're like, well, I actually don't know and I don't care to know. And I think that was really what hits hard. Like, I just think, Robyn, you speak about person first. A whole 100% agree. But how do we get people to do that?
My personal view is it's changing. I don't know. I coach the coaches in netball, and if they're coaching the coaches in netball, they coach anyone that wants to play netball. They can get a choice of society leaders don't get a choice in who they serve. I don't personally understand it, and I don't think no or sit over there is an answer. And I think in this day and age, it is about how and each one of the different marginalised groups over the years is exactly the same. Why can't women do this, and why can't everybody can? It's just giving the opportunity. So I think we just need to keep talking about it and representing people to allow them to be who they want to be when they want to be. And I think the circumstances, they need to change. And if universities aren't training teachers that are going out in society to be able to teach all children, then there's something going wrong. So there's just no excuse for me these days. There's always a way of finding a way of working with anybody that wants to do physical education or whatever it is. And half of them don't, because if they're excluded, We just need to be innovative to make sure that everyone is able to partake in sport like we have been lucky enough to do.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, I'm just gonna, I don't think there are any other questions we have in the chat. If anybody has any questions, feel free to put your hand up and turn your camera on and unmute yourself and we can ask questions. Otherwise, I'm just going to read out a few comments from our fourth panel member, Jeff Trappett. And I think Jeff has added in some gems in here. He wrote, when we were speaking about policy, each local council that holds events for Brisbane should also be influencing policy and legislation for the better too. Imagine all of them going to the property council and government jointly saying, let's work together to strengthen the access to premise legislation. We want to do more. Imagine. Jeff also made a comment about government can put in a requirement in procurement guidelines that the engagement strategy of a builder needs to be signed off by a disability peak body, recognised disability peak body. Yeah, that is a great point, Jeff. As well as workplace gender equity. Wonder if has there been any other questions that have come through. I also have, oh, sorry, Jordan, where are you? Oh, right here, sorry. So just following on from Kelsey's comment about schools, Jordan mentioned, I want to add to that by asking what opportunities are currently available for parasport participation at the grassroots level, and are athletes available to participate in sports recreationally without being put on a Paralympic pathway? Great question.
I mean, I think sport across, I shouldn't be answering all these, but I mean, just my opinion clearly, but I think sport in general is looking at ways of being more inclusive. I know at both state level and federal level, they're looking at what their policy is and how they can be more inclusive. I think everybody understands that to be involved in sport doesn't mean that you're going to become a Paralympian or an Olympian. What it means is you have an opportunity. And I think people with a disability, and I don't have a disability, I've just been working in the area for 34 years, but I think you go to the sport that's got a pathway that's normalised. And I think we just need to normalise more sport opportunities. So as long as you partake in it, you know that there's an opportunity for any good, just like anybody else in Australia. So I think that, yeah, we all need to be responsible for that and yeah, have everyone have an opportunity to play it. If you're any good, you go to state level, any good, you go to national level, any good, you represent Australia. And if you're not, you play socially like all of us.
There's a lot of work being done by non-Paralympic sports in being more inclusive. Like I know, like hockey, they're an Olympic sport, not a Paralympic sport. They are doing heaps of coaching, education around being more inclusive. AFL, again, they're doing a heap of work in this as well. So it's definitely improving. And I know I made the comment at the start that people just come along and then they get forced into a Paralympic pathway, but it's not necessarily true for all sports.
There's a big geographical element to this as well, right? Like a lot of people get put into sports at that grassroots level, but it's usually, not always, but it's usually, unless you're in Southeast Queensland, for example, in our state, it's usually wheelchair basketball or swimming or athletics, because those are the sports that have reach across the state, where most other parasports, there's just not infrastructure, equipment, personnel located outside of Southeast Queensland to be able to support it.
Yeah, I agree. I think just going back to Jordan's questions, what opportunities are currently available for parasport participation? I think Ben mentioned wheelchair basketball, you've got swimming, you've got athletics, and I would recommend reaching out to your local club. Paralympics Australia have a wonderful resource in Natalie Charlton about parasport participation in the grassroots level. So the team will be able to find you an organisation or pull you in the right direction. There are local clubs like Sharon Hills, or the Sun Coast Spinners, you know, in the Sunshine Coast. There's the Sporting Wheelies in Brisbane. There's rollerblades and wheelchair rugby on the Gold Coast. And I mean, this is just southeast Queensland. There is multiple other opportunities. Griffith University have a inclusive athletics event that's hosted, I believe, on a Saturday at
Table
the
tennis
racetrack
as well, para-table
Yeah.
tennis as well.
Table tennis.
And
There's so
Livestream
many
is also working with sport to build opportunities from school sport or through to elite level with athletes with intellectual impairment. So, yeah, I'll beat you, Chantal.
Beautiful. We have a comment in here that's just come through around. Mick, you can just say AFL wheelchair.
Just putting it on record.
Might as well mention your hook shot again.
It was beautiful.
From Melissa around, I understand that there's a level of privilege in para-equestrian sport compared to other sports, so it's not as accessible, but I also wish there was more work to be done to emphasize its value as a Paralympic sport and at the grassroots level. The horse becomes a rider's legs, eyes, and removes excess disability in a way that is so liberating. Please don't ever apologise for banging on about equestrian in the media representation. It is something that, you know, we are aware of and that I think is actively trying to change that. And we saw some incredible para-equestrian riders in over in Paris, and I've had some stuff to do with Emma Booth. Unfortunately, she wasn't available. She wasn't in Paris, but it's incredible. I love it. I personally am allergic to horses, so I won't be getting involved in para-equestrian.
Watch from afar.
Yeah, I'll watch from afar. The pretty horses. All right, well, thank you. We are going to wrap up here. If anyone else has any other questions, pop them into the chat and we'll be able to access them later. I just want to say thank you so much to Mick, Ben and Robyn. Your insights have been incredibly valuable, and what a great panel this has been. So thank you so much. I'm sure everybody's learned and heard so much, and that'll take into, you know, government. I hear we're on the line as well, sport, and those at university. So thank you so much. We appreciate you and your time. And yeah, so thank you.
Thank you
Thanks,
for
Ella.
coordinating it. It was great. And
Yeah.
I mean, as I said, half of the panel has lived in Benalla for a period of time. Everyone else is going, where is that?
Great little spot.
It is a
Actually,
great
go to
little
the
spot.
Benalla Footy Club and just check out all Robyn's names up on the left on the honour boards up there. It's pretty impressive.
Beautiful. Well, thank you so much.